Hello, welcome to Delectable Tiny Gardens Live. It is 2 p.m. Eastern here near the shores of Lake Erie in eastern Ohio. It is hot, it is humid. I have no AC in the house. Everything that I do is simple and you can do it because I do very little fancy with very fancy tools. So I figured I'd take a little bit of time today and do a question and answer session so that you know what I'm about and how I work and do things. So, hey, I've got some questions that I have had submitted to me from other places and in the comments sections. So I'm going to start with those. If you have questions, please put them in the chat and I will answer as many as I can today. So give this a couple more minutes and we will get things rolling. All right. So, what is Delectable Tiny Gardens? We'll start with Delectable Tiny Gardens is a meeting place for people that are looking to develop and learn how to grow food in the tiny spaces that they have available to them. In the background, you can see a couple of windows, and if that's where you have to grow food, that's enough. You can grow food in the space that you have and the time that you have if you have just a little bit of knowledge, and it doesn't take much for tools and equipment. So I have people ask me a lot of questions, and we're going to get started with some of the questions that people have asked of me in various different places. So, and the first is, what is it? What do I mean when I say a tiny garden? That's very subjective. Okay, that depends on what you perceive as a garden. To me, a tiny garden can be anything from uh, something planted in a milk jug to a big container, or it can be a small garden in their backyard. All of those are tiny gardens, depending upon what your space is and uh, how you think how you perceive what a garden is and what a big garden is as opposed to a small garden. And I work on all of those scales from a small container in the size of a milk jug to a small raised bed that you can feed a family out of. So all of those are tiny gardens to me, but most of my focus is teaching people how to um, grow food and herbs in containers and things that they can find around their house that are inexpensive. So it's very inexpensive to start and very few tools. It's a very, very easy starting point to grow your own food. Okay. Again, be sure to put any questions in the chat that you want answered, and I will answer as many as I can here. Okay. Another question that I get is, I had somebody ask me or make the comment that I have heard that you can plant anything in a pot, but are there things that should not be planted in a pot? Oh, well, technically, it is true that you can plant almost anything in a container, um, if the container's big enough. The key is to start with a small plant and let it grow into the container. And there are some plants that really do not thrive well in a container. Um, I'm not gonna give specifics, but what you look for a container plant is something that is naturally on the small side. It has shallower roots rather than a deep tap root. Uh, and it can be productive at a small size. Some of the things that I would think twice about growing in containers are deep tap-rooted trees, uh, and some of your herbaceous plants that get very, very big before they produce anything. But mostly what I think twice about when I'm looking at container gardens is trees. So you want to make sure that your tree does not, before you plant a tree in a container, make sure that it does not have a deep taproot naturally. Beyond that, and the other thing to look for with trees and bushes is that they tend to grow slowly. So as long as it's a slower growing plant, a little bit smaller to start with, and it doesn't have a taproot, you can probably grow it in a container. The naturally bigger trees and plants are going to need a bigger container. So start with things that are smaller, a little bit smaller and easier to grow, and grow your skills into that. Okay. So next question, somebody, and I run into this problem. So this is a good question. Okay. Somebody wanted to start their own seeds indoors, but they don't have good light. They want to know if they have to invest into expensive grow lights in order to start their own seeds? Or another way to put this is, can I grow food without light? And the answer to that is yes. It's more difficult. Um, if you have very little light available to you, grow lights make life a lot easier to grow plants. There are some plants that do not require light to germinate, and even the ones that do require light to germinate do not require very much. So yes, technically, you can grow seeds in low light conditions, but it's difficult. I do it here at Delectable Tiny Gardens because I do not have a greenhouse, and this front room where I'm sitting is where the best light is. But it's still not enough light to grow most vegetables well. So what I do is I germinate the plants inside, and I germinate the seeds inside, but I wait and do it a little bit later than I normally would, and then move them outside because I have space outside. I move them outside to get as much light as I can give them when the weather conditions are favorable. So I will start them inside a little bit later than normal, and I take them outside when I can. And there are some ways to improve your ability to grow plants doing that. It does take a little bit more management to do that. So you don't have to invest in the expensive grow lights. It does help. It makes life easier, and it takes less of your time management to do it with the grow lights than what I do. So the answer to that is yes, but okay. Now, here's a good one. There's so many people that live in apartments, and I had somebody that lives in an apartment ask me this. In fact, the space that I'm living in right now is essentially an apartment with a garden out back. Okay. So, can I still have a garden? And of course, you can still have a garden no matter where you are. Okay. In an apartment, even if you have very little light, you can still garden. I had I lived in an RV for 20 years. I had a garden in my RV. Okay. There are some tricks that I use to do that, but it works. So it doesn't matter where you are, you can have a garden. When you are gardening in an apartment or in a small space like an RV, then you garden in containers, and you garden in small containers that maybe you can move around a little bit. So, yes, you absolutely can grow food in an apartment. This is one that is near and dear to my heart because I have most of my life I have been on a very, very tight budget. And one of the reasons that many people do not garden is they think it is expensive to get started, and it doesn't have to be. So here's the question. Fertilizer is expensive, and yes, it is, and it's getting more expensive. And some of the other garden inputs that people think they have to have are expensive, and they're getting more expensive. The person that asked this also says that fertilizer can be confusing to use. There's numbers on there, there's instructions, and if you don't understand what that package is saying, it is definitely confusing. The question is there a cheaper and less confusing way to improve the soil and make sure that you have healthy plants? Okay, because part of the purpose for growing plants is to have those healthy plants. So those healthy plants feed us and keep us healthy. And yes, there is absolutely a better way. Okay. In a very small space, okay, on a shelf in the kitchen, I have a worm composting system. Okay. It is in a old milk crate. So a space that is 14 inches by 14 inches, less than 2 square feet. And I have built a worm composting system that it tucks into a shelf. I pull it out, I feed it the kitchen scraps, and then put it back on the shelf. It's out of the way, it's handy to get to, convenient, and I produce lots and lots of beautiful fertility for the plants that I am growing, from things that normally would go into the landfill if you weren't recycling it. So the best way that I know of to bypass all those expenses, okay, is to recycle what you've got. This, your food scraps, and there's some ins and outs to doing that. And I do have a workshop at Delectable Tiny Gardens that teaches worm composting, and that is your best way to keep fertility in your soil. There are other tricks to use that bring the cost of gardening, container gardening, down to just a few pennies, to a few dollars, so that it's accessible to almost anybody. Okay, but the soil and the fertilizer can be some of the most expensive parts of container gardening and tiny gardening. Okay. Water. Water is a big one. The person asked that if plants should be watered every day that it doesn't rain. Particular water plants in containers. The answer is no on that one. Plants should be watered when they need water. Okay, and most plants will develop a tolerance to fluctuating soil moisture as long as it doesn't fluctuate too far out of the range. But if you let that soil moisture fluctuate a little bit, that actually creates sturdier plants and more durable plants. A container garden can need water every day, depending upon the conditions that it's growing in, because they're small and there's a less of a reserve for the water. But the real way to know if you need to water the plant or not is checking the soil. And again, that depends on the plant. So some plants like it dry, some plants like it moist, some plants like to live in the water. And you water according to what the plant needs. So it depends. It really depends. It's just a matter of start with one plant. Okay. Know what your personality is, whether you want to baby that plant and mess with it every single day, or whether you want to plant it and let it do its own thing. Okay. If you have a tendency to plant it and walk away, then you want a plant that's likes a little bit drier conditions, and you're not going to water it every day. If you like a plant, if you like to be messing with it every single day, then maybe a little one that wants a little bit more moisture. But it really does depend. Depends on the plant itself. So start with one plant. Start with a plant that matches the conditions that you can give it, and learn that one plant. And you'll figure out what you need to do to keep that plant thriving. Then you learn the next one. Here's another question about water. Okay. And Water is a big, big issue when you're growing plants. The two most important things of growing plants is the water. The three things that you need to understand about growing when you grow a plant is the water, the soil, and the light. And water is a big one. So the question is, can I use tap water to water plants? That depends on your tap water. Sometimes you can, sometimes you can't. Sometimes you can with some adjustments. It all depends upon where your tap water comes from and how it is treated before it gets to your tap. So if you are on well water, most likely you can use your tap water to water your plants. But have it tested to make sure. If it's well water and it's not treated and it's safe for you to drink, it's safe for the plants. Most municipalities treat the water with various different chemicals, and whether that water is safe to water your plants or not depends upon what chemicals are used to treat the water. If it's just chlorine, you can let that chlorine sit for a couple of days to dissipate the chlorine, and then you can water the plants with it. But straight out of the tap is usually not a good idea to water your plants. If it here where I'm at, the tap water is treated with something that does not dissipate and it actually kills the plants. So if I water plants with the tap water here, they're not going to grow. So it's just if you're in that situation, then the best thing to do is to collect rainwater and water your plants with the rainwater. But the answer is it depends. It depends upon what's in your water. Rainwater is almost always your rainwater, or melted snow is almost always your best water for watering plants. But whether you can use the tap water depends. The other option is you can get a inline or a tap-based water filter. So there's a number of different water filters that you can purchase to put on your faucet or on the sink or on the counter to filter your water and use the filtered water to water your plants. So sometimes, I mean, it took me a year of experimenting with the tap water to figure out why my plants weren't thriving here. So I use rainwater as much as possible. And sometimes in the winter, I'll go collect snow and let that melt. And when it warms up, I'll use that to water the plants. Yeah. Yeah. Okay. The next question that I have today has to do with money. Okay. So if you're the person says, I am on a very limited budget. Okay. Plants and pots are expensive, supplies are expensive, tools are expensive. It doesn't make sense for me to grow food instead of buying it because everything to put into that growing is expensive. If you go, here's my answer to that. Okay. I grow food because food is expensive. I grow food because the food at the grocery store is full of chemicals that I don't want. And it's getting more and more expensive every day. Most of my life, I've been on a very, very tight budget. There are ways of growing food that are almost free. Take very little money to get started, very little time, and you produce good food. Especially the things that are expensive and chemical, they have lots of chemicals in the store. It makes sense to grow them yourself. I use recycled pots. So I grow things in milk jugs. I grow things in Goodwill finds. I go to garage sales and find old pots and pans, an old bucket, okay, an old trash can. I've grown herbs in a plastic drawer unit that the unit broke, so I took the drawers out of it and made containers out of it. Recycle refrigerator containers, recycled yogurt containers, all of those make very good pots. So you can come up with pots and containers for almost nothing. Okay. A packet of seeds is getting more expensive, but it's still less expensive than buying groceries at the grocery store. And it is less expensive than buying the plants. There are ways of taking cuttings, and even if you buy a plant, taking cuttings and making your own plants after you have your first one is also a very inexpensive way to get more. So you can grow a lot of food and a lot of herbs for very little money if you learn the tricks. And those tricks are some of the things I teach over at Delectable Tiny Gardens, to get people started, to help them find the containers that they need as a beginning gardener so that they can, and how to turn them into effective little gardens for themselves. The most expensive input that I put into my tiny gardens, is the potting soil. And I recycle that potting soil over and over and over again so that one bag of potting soil will grow food for me for a long, long time. Because I've got my worm bin, and because I cycle that through various different plants, various different species, it doesn't take much upfront cost to grow food. So you can do it. You definitely can do it. Here's a good one. And this is where I started. Okay. What if you've never grown anything before? Well, all of us start there. Okay. What if you kill the plant? Okay. Or I had somebody ask me or make the comment, I killed my last plant and I'm afraid I'll do it again. Yeah. We've all done it. It's part of the learning process. But that's why I encourage people to start small, start with one plant, learn that one plant, learn that one vegetable, and try again. Get the advice, get the coaching, talk to people that have been through this before. I've killed more plants than I want to count, and I'm still killing them. Every time I push my skills or I'm working with a plant that I've never worked with before, there's that risk. Start small. Start small, get the coaching, come over at Delectable Tiny Gardens and, or ask questions here. And we'll talk you through it. Okay. We'll get you going on the best foot that we can. If you have problems, we'll talk you through them. But there's always somebody to help. The best thing to do is try. Try and learn. Making mistakes is part of the learning process. We don't worry about it. Okay, we get you through with the least fuss, the least mess, okay, and the fewest problems, and solve them as quickly as we can. Okay, making mistakes and doing things not quite right is always part of the learning process, and you don't learn until you do it. So try, come and try. I have a friend that loves her flowers. And mostly she's grown ornamentals. But she asked me, what she said was that I want fruits and seeds as well as the flowers. Should I deadhead my plants to get more flowers or just let them go to seed? Well, it depends. Depends on what you want. Okay. You grow the plant and manage the plant to get out of that plant what you want. If what you want is mostly the flowers, and a lot of those flowers are edible and medicinal, and that's fantastic. Those are the ones I grow. Harvesting those flowers for food and herbs is the equivalent of deadheading, and that encourages more flowers. Some flowers, like roses, actually produce a fruit. But if you let it fruit, you're going to get fewer flowers, and the flowers are also edible and medicinal. So it's really going to depend. If you want seeds, you have to let some of the flowers go to seed, and there are procedures for that. What I do when I'm working with my herbal flowers is if I want to collect seeds to eat or to plant for next year, I harvest the flowers through the first half of the season and let the last half of the season go to seed. So there's ways of getting both. Okay. But again, that's a matter of learning the crop and learning the plant, and then deciding for yourself what you want to do. You could do both. You can do one or the other. It's just a matter of what you want to do. Herbs. That leads us into the herbs. So, are herbs different from vegetables? Not really. It Herbs and vegetables, the difference between herbs, vegetables, and fruits is more a matter of how you talk about them and how you use them. So it's a convention. It's just a matter of how you look at it, not anything inherent in the plant itself. So for me, an herb is something that is used in small quantities for flavor, or either for flavor or medicinal uses, or maybe aromatherapy. That's how I usually think of herbs. Vegetables, I think of as something that is substantial that's going to fill the tummy. A fruit usually is more, to me, is a little more sweet and dessert oriented, and that's all convention. As it's all how you think about it and how you talk about the plant. So there really isn't that much difference between it's between an herb and a vegetable and a fruit. So whatever, parsley can be an herb or parsley can be a vegetable. Okay. It just depends on how you use it and how you think about it. Okay. One of the things that I want to make sure that I cover is tools, because that is one of the things that it people don't necessarily ask me specifically, but it is an important tools are an important topic when you're talking about gardening. And one of the things that I love about tiny gardens is you already have the tools in your house that you need, most likely, that you need to garden in a tiny garden, especially if it's containers. So all you really need to garden in a little container is the container itself, and that's recycled, a way to make drainage holes in it. Okay, and that can be an old paring knife, a pocket knife, a drill, okay, or a hot nail, or nail and hammer. So things that most people already have. Okay, you can garden with a spoon and a knife. Okay, so if you've got an old tablespoon and an old table knife, it's nothing fancy, or save your plastic utensils from your next takeout. Okay, all of those, that's all you need to garden in a tiny container. A pair of scissors. Okay, you don't need a fancy pruner most of the time. Depends on what you're growing, but start with a pair of scissors. Okay, a pair of scissors, a cheap paring knife, table knife, and a spoon. Okay, a couple of containers recycled from something else, and that's all the tools that you need for a tiny garden, a tiny container garden. If you're going to garden in a raised bed, a little bit more, but not much. Not much. Other than building the raised beds, I garden garden outside in the raised bed with a soil knife, uh, basically with a soil knife and a pruner. Okay, I do have a shovel that I use to fill the beds with, but that I don't use that for the most part. That's part of the beauty of tiny gardens, is instead of having to invest in tillers and shovels and all kinds of fancy equipment, most people already have everything they need to grow food in the tiny spaces that they've got. And this brings up the next point. Okay, some of the tools that you use in a big garden, in a flat garden, conventional garden, take a lot of physical energy. Okay, and people that have got limited time and limited physical abilities, limited funds, it just becomes too much of a reach. So when you're tiny gardens, whether you're gardening in a bucket or a yogurt container or a gallon milk jug, okay, or an old stock pot, okay, All of those are small, they're easily movable, they take very little as far as tools, and they take very little time. So, any limitation that you've got, that container gardening, that tiny garden, eliminates most of those barriers. It eliminates most of those limitations and challenges that people have with gardening. If you can't bend over, a tiny garden brings that to you. Okay. I can't be on my, I've got injured knees. I cannot be down on my knees. That tiny garden brings stuff up to me so that I'm not having to sit on the ground or kneel on the ground, so that I can garden effectively in just a tiny space. So that's what a tiny garden does. It just takes away a lot of those challenges that a traditional conventional garden present to people, that makes that gardening difficult and challenging. So yeah, it's just beautiful, beautiful concept. So, you know, I have had, this has just been absolutely gorgeous and a joy to answer these questions for people today. And I'll be honest, most of them came from outside of the live stream. So, people just fed me questions all week. And some of them came from my own experience. Okay. But this has been a beautiful, beautiful hour for me to talk about how to make garden much easier than most people think it is. And that's what Delectable Tiny Gardens is all about. Okay. It's Delectable Tiny Gardens is a school membership where I and myself and others help people get through some of the early challenges of gardening and learn to garden in those tiny spaces. It's about learning to grow food and herbs in the tiny spaces that you have, in the tiny amount of time that you have, and without putting a lot of money into it. It doesn't take much to grow a little bit of food. And once you've started growing a little bit, then you can go wherever you want to go with it. Okay. Do you want to go big? You want to stay small. But there are ways of growing food for yourself without the chemicals and without the fuss and without the expense that most people associate with gardening. And it's not that difficult with a little bit of knowledge and a little bit of guidance. So come and join us. Okay, I would love to see you over at Delectable Tiny Gardens, and we can walk you through your first little garden and get you going the right way, get you off to the good start on a good foot. And you know what? This August is a perfect time to join Delectable Tiny Gardens, because we're doing a workshop starting on August 8th that will walk you through everything that you need to know to grow your first tiny garden in a container. So we're going to get you going so that you've got food for the fall and maybe even onto the winter, depending upon what you choose to grow. So come and join us. It's going to be fun. And we'll walk you all the way through the process. And we're going to get you going with your first food, your first garden. So, hey, you know what? Thanks for joining me. It's been fun, and come and join us. We'll talk to you there.